Good afternoon. I can't see people, so I'm going to assume that people who are supposed to be here are here. We're going to get started on the webinar called Values-Led Data Governance, Network Thinking for Pragmatic Digital Strategies. And before we move forward, just a couple housekeeping. One is that you'll see there is no chat function. So instead, if you use the Q&A, both Tom and I will be monitoring that. And then, we're happy to take questions. We do have a question period at the end. But if you do have questions in the middle that you think would contribute to clarity, raise your hand and then we can unmute you. And for those of you who signed up a while ago, you may have signed up for an AI-focused data governance course. So the AI focus is no longer in this one. However, the concepts are the same, and we are happy to chat with you about how it relates to AI work. So if we move to the outline of today's session, we'll just do a brief intro to Tom and I and to Open North, talk about why data governance, how we landed there, and then more specifically, what is values-led and networked data governance, our approach, and then we'll finish off with a discussion. So Open North, so I guess we'll start with myself. My name is Merlin. I am the executive director at Open North. And my colleague Tom is the senior coordinator who leads a lot of the content development in data governance work. So Open North, for those of you who are not so familiar with who we are, organization founded in 2011. We're a national and international focused not-for-profit with domain expertise in data governance, digital strategy, and we do work with clients from the public and private sectors and civil society. And so some of the projects that we're learning through, just to set up where this content comes from, we've been running the Community Solutions Network, the lead technical host or the lead technical organization for the Infrastructure Canada funded Community Solutions Network. And in that work, we do data governance and digital strategy with local governments across Canada, focused on when people were really into the smart city conversation and smart technologies, moving often into the climate work, and then just integration of the two, how smart technologies and climate action are aligned. And then we've also been doing a more intensive project with the City of Montreal and helping them develop a data governance framework for interaction with civil society organizations. And another project in the civil society space that we're working with local and national organizations that are addressing gender-based violence and sexual assault. And in that, we're supporting data management, data governance, and then the creation of a federated data hub to facilitate sharing of data. We're also involved in the development of a climate data hub, working with the City of Montreal, the Montreal Climate Partnership, Concordia University, and a large group of private actors in the greater Montreal area. So we're leading the development of the digital infrastructure and also the work on data governance. And one of my focus areas when joining Open North is really to take this idea of data governance and bring it into complex social challenges and demonstrate how it really applies and how necessary it is. And so that's where this work originates. But just as a bit of a caveat is that this is really the leading edge of our thinking, and so it's emerging out of the work that we're doing, but we're a little light on what actual case studies and talking about it through established case studies. It's because the work is happening as we speak. So we will be using examples, but they are, live examples. Some of them have happened, yesterday. And so we don't have established case studies that we'll be running through today. On the next slide, just talking about, giving a place to start and why data governance. And Open North has been in the data space since its beginnings, and was at the forefront of the open data movement in Canada, and have always believed in the power and the consequences of data, and believe that having it more accessible increases the likelihood of data-informed decision-making. And one of the challenges that those of us in the open data community encountered was that the focus on government data really created a bit of a false dichotomy between open and closed data. The surge in open data portals that we saw were primarily populated with superficial data and really non-politically sensitive data. And there are good reasons for that, for not opening lots of data sources. And there's obviously value and continues to be value in this movement, because it's really helping to bring people closer to government held information, and in some ways has begun to identify and break down data silos. We did a report in 2016 on early adopters of the Open Data Charter that emphasized open by default as a principle. And one of the key findings from that research was that in the rush to open data, all of the preconditions for opening and sharing good quality and high value data were glossed over. And instead of building data and digital maturity and working on internal data collaborations across departments and external data collaborations across sectors, there's really a singular focus on opening data. And what we found too with opening data is that just because it's open doesn't mean it's accessible. And so marginalized groups and regular residents and clients, just because the data is there in raw form doesn't mean they can do anything about it. So and then in addition to not aligning with Indigenous data sovereignty issues. So that led us to broaden our focus to data governance, because at its core, data governance is about who gets to make decisions, who benefits from data, and it can and should be facilitating a fundamental shift in power. And opening and sharing data is a key output of data governance. So it really is a broadening of the focus rather than a shift. And this idea of data governance is not new. And so, if we consider that data governance is simply how data management is done, how decisions are made and who makes them, then we acknowledge that data governance exists, whether we are intentional about it or not. And one of the problems that we see is that a lack of intentional data governance causes issues within organizations, barriers to collaboration across departments, and often reinforces systems of inequity. And that that inequity is exacerbated as you start to layer other technologies, other digital technologies on it. As we start thinking about AI, the issues of bias and inequity in data access and control of data becomes amplified. And so our focus then is on how data governance can be applied in ways that support governments and organizations to address their complex challenges. How do we make it meaningful? And then this leads to the question of what is good and intentional data governance. And so Open North has always been a values-led organization. And so what we've started to do is to say, what is values-led data governance? What is values-led digital transformation? How do we be values-led in our work and not just conceptually? And so, we talk about guided by values to produce value. And we talk about values held in the civic space and creating value that are in the interest of the common good. So we published a paper in 2021 about civic value and open smart communities. And it proposed that organizations should actively discuss and declare their values as they choose, create, and implement their services that generate value. And so, as we've got on the slide here, that we would see values-led data governance holding transparency, inclusivity, responsibility, and accountability as primary, and then secondary sustainability, privacy, and security. And the way that each of these are emphasized will be different based on the environment that they're occurring in. And so, what this means in practice, if we take inclusivity as an example, is data governance is guided by a belief that decisions using data should be made with people who are most affected by the decisions and who are most represented in the data. And the value that we're trying to create with data governance goes beyond business efficiency and revenue, and rather value is, from our perspective, something that contributes to the common good. So experiencing value from data governance could be as simple as getting better informed through intermediaries who have access to data, experiencing more appropriate service delivery, more effective service delivery. And there's an inherent interconnectedness between data governance and the ecosystem within which it occurs that affects the value that can be achieved. So the values, how they play out in the ecosystem and the desired values should be considered in any data governance approach. And so recognizing that this is all still very conceptual, I wanted to go quickly into the next slide and just this is a project that we're working on. So a values-led data governance approach, the values, this is with a civil society organization, a national organization that is attempting to create a federated data hub that combines open data with some very sensitive data. And so looking at how do we share data in a safe way that contributes to improving the value of their service offering. And so the values that they came up with, and this was a process that we facilitated, the value of being inclusive with both users and stakeholders, and then survivor-centered. This data is around gender-based violence and sexual assault. So how do we make keep survivors as the focus of the decisions that were being made, accountable, advocacy focused, so providing more access to data so that organizations can advocate for their services and just be able to influence the narrative nationally. And then transparent. The goals of the data hub are transparent. People know what it is, how it's been developed, who's managing it, how decisions are made. Go to the next slide. So instead of having us just talk at you, we wanted to invite some of your participation. I'm hoping that most of you are familiar with Slido. So if you could join where it says at slido.com, or take your phone and take a fancy little picture. And the question that we're looking at is, wanting to know where we're starting from. So how aligned are projects in achieving your values horizontally across business units as well as vertically within units practice? And we're using the term business units pretty broadly. If public sector, that would make sense to you. But I think within nonprofit and civil society organizations, across teams, across projects. This is a very safe group. Um, people, I guess somehow, what's interesting to me is that there is no votes to how it's extremely aligned. So when it's in the middle, to me, it sort of indicates that that there's maybe some unintentional alignment just based on organizational culture, but that maybe it's not discussed a lot. So if you have something to, if you have a comment to make about this, about your vote, feel free to either raise your hand or here, you can put it into the Q&A as well. We'll move to the next slide.
I believe that's me. Hi, everyone. So what we'd like to do here is talk a bit about what holistic data governance means, why we're using this slightly odd term. And for a bit of background, Merlin and I did have a conversation about how much we dislike the word holistic. I'm going to use it and then quickly abandon it for the words that are actually in the title, network and ecosystem. But I think holistic is a good conceptual entry point to what we want to talk about here. So bear with me while I use it for a little bit, and then we can go back to using terms that I didn't steal from 8th grade biology and instead actually belong firmly in the social and technical realm. So many people these days, didn't used to be the case, but these days more and more so, have started talking about values-led data governance, AI governance, etc. Values are very important. We like talking about principles and values and ethics-based governance and all of that. And we're no different at Open North. We think that's extremely important. We have, from the very get-go, always taken a values-led approach and suggested to many clients, participants, workshop attendees, etc., that the first thing you do when developing any kind of data governance is to set up a charter or some charter-like document that publicly lists all your values and principles. Because from a kind of theoretical perspective, that's a great way to start. And then you can derive your goals and strategies and mechanisms and tactics, etc., from the values and principles that you espouse. And that's great. But through the years, working closely with cities, municipalities of all sizes, nonprofit organizations, community organizations, etc., we've come to realize that the translation from these values down to the, let's call them the slightly more technocratic seeming mechanisms, is not so cut and dry. It's actually quite a bit more complicated than that. But it's at that level that many of the people have come to us with questions, issues, challenges, etc., in this domain. So spanning that gap, that operationalization gap, is what we're trying to get at here. So you'll see on this slide, values-led, inclusive, transparent, accountable, responsible decision-making. That's all great. But about what? And then there's this endless list of things that are the real challenges that people are trying to be values-led on. Everything from data quality through to master data, data management, data sharing, metadata standards, etc. There's an endless array. So how do we span that gap? And at Open North, we have started exploring a different approach, which we're calling the holistic approach, at least holistic for now. And it starts by seeing these seemingly technical issues in two different ways. One, as fundamentally interconnected with each other. That means these different technical aspects don't stand alone. They frequently are prerequisites for each other in complicated ways. For example, if you want an open data program, you probably have to have data quality established first, right? And then that list goes on. There's a long, and we'll get into the details of this, interconnectedness of these different components. And while it may sometimes be difficult to see the values in a single technical project, once you start looking at them from the interconnected perspective, you very quickly see the values that are involved in designing a system or a strategy or a governance framework or whatever in one way over another way. And that is what we're going to explore a bit more today. So when we say holistic, we're obviously also implying there's such a thing as a non-holistic approach. Now, I don't mean this as any slight towards the Dharma frameworks here. In fact, the oldie Dharma book is sitting right. Oh, you can't see it because it's right there. I use it almost every day. It's excellent. These frameworks are a great way of understanding what all the different components of data governance could be and giving you insight into how they work, etc. However, what these frameworks don't do is show the interconnectedness of the different components in a way beyond as they're sort of next to each other or in the wheel, just vaguely proximate. They don't actually show the causal or prerequisite connections, the dependencies from one to another. And that's what we're trying to get at. And because they are primarily for the private sector, they don't get at the different kinds of values that the public sector would employ. Private sector is primarily focused on efficiency and profit, whereas the public sector has a whole range of other values that are implied when you're thinking about the complex relationship between government and public. So this rather strange squiggly network diagram here is a proof of concept that we are developing to show the interdependencies of all of these different components and show that you can understand them as a network. And that when you see them as a network, you see them also as a network embedded in a larger ecosystem. What do I mean by that? So the network is clear, right? You have all these different components in data management and data governance and data maturity. They all are connected to each other in one way or another. Some are dependencies for others. Others are prerequisites for yet further steps. And you can chart them out like that and show how they're interconnected. So what this enables, and this is really key for us, and this was a core insight that we got from many of our projects, is that you can choose to start anywhere. You can come to the project with a challenge in any one of these areas, and from there very rapidly chart out a potential strategy and understand what the prerequisites for fixing the immediate challenge are, and how, by exploring the network, you can quickly identify a strategy that then leads to values. And further, once you see this as an ecosystem, so a system where there are a number of components connected to each other that function together for a greater benefit, then you very rapidly understand the value that you are trying to create in the world, whether it is a better informed public, a more equitable service delivery, internal data maturity, you name it. Once you start looking at it from a networked perspective, from a network that functions in an ecosystem that includes the public sector, the private sector, the public itself, all of that, you can very quickly understand the values that you are embodying with one strategy versus another one.
So given that Tom and I are both recovering academics, we throw in a slide here that just repeats everything that Tom just said. And so, data governance has multiple technocratic entry points, and any data management or technical concern from an Open North perspective should be viewed within a networked lens. And it's often hard to see values inherent in these individual components, but it becomes clearer when you see the interconnectedness. And then the value you achieve out of data governance should be guided by your values, the values of your organization. And while you start anywhere, if we're starting at data quality, our focus should still be on growth of the network and network effects. And then the last point there on the ecosystem around network data governance, it should and can produce value that extends beyond your organization. At Open North, we like to use the the term the common good. And it's really key to identify, beyond your organizational objectives, what are the short, medium, and long-term ecosystem change goals. And this leads us to another question: is when considering the data needs of a new project, to what degree are the considerations informed by other projects or policies and strategies organization-wide? So what is your current network perspective on data management and data governance projects? And so we'll just give it a couple minutes. So this is interesting, and I think makes sense, is expected in a way, because we recognize the technical connection between many of these different data management components. So it does make sense that this is already happening, whether intentional or not. I'd love to hear more about this when we get to a Q&A point too. So, so the next slide is really just introducing our perspective on networked ecosystem and questions to ask to enter. And one of the things I always say, we recognize that data governance and a values-led approach to data governance is not linear, and yet our diagrams, our visuals are still linear, but they're just a little bit wavy. So that's where the impetus behind Tom's interconnected diagram came. But for now, we're representing the fact that some people will enter at challenges. If there's challenges around data quality or data sharing, that's your entry point into network data governance. And then there needs to be a conversation about what data you're using, how you're using it, what data you have access to, and where are your data gaps. Often questions that will emerge somewhere down the line when you're trying to achieve a certain value or a goal. And then how does this align with the organization's overall values and principle? And how do you make sure that the efforts that you're putting into some of these data management solutions are actually raising the maturity of the organization when it comes to data governance?
All right, back to the crazy network diagram. I do love this diagram. It took me several hours to make, and it was a lot of fun. It's still very much work in progress, but as a proof of concept for the networked nature and as a proof of concept for a chart of dependencies, I think it works quite well. And what these questions on the side and the preceding questions as well intend is a form of process guide into the network. And I say that with a implicit question mark on the end, because it is not intended to be linear, as we've said before. Like, these questions, you can start with any one of these questions and work from there. And the whole point of having a non-linear set of questions is that it allows you to explore this network and consider which dependencies are important to your project, and which dependencies, because of course each dependency has others, are then a kind of second order relevant to your project. So if you look at these questions here, you can start by situating your challenge on the map and then looking at whatever data management or data governance components are involved. And I'll get into a few examples after this. And then you can, once you've charted out 3, 4, 5, 6 dependencies, as many as you want, then you can start considering what data ecosystems, values, and goals are being furthered by looking at that particular aspect of the network, those components of the network. And it'll always be different, but it will give you a good idea of what you're looking at. And then that's the real question, is when you're thinking about adding or modifying or building upon these components, when you do that, how does it change the network? How does it change the ecosystem when you add one type of component or another, or you intervene in one aspect of the network or a different aspect of the network? Those are decisions about the system and its effect on the broader ecosystem. And all decisions like that are ultimately values-based decisions, because you wouldn't be making any kind of decision if you weren't expecting a kind of outcome. So this forces you to really look at the outcomes that you want and the outcomes that you don't want when affecting the system, when redesigning components of your data governance network. And really think about how it will then go on to function in your ecosystem and what impacts you will have. And we really have been trialing this approach through several different projects now. Merlin spoke of the one project before with EVA, but we've also been working with a small town in Nova Scotia that has unique data governance challenges and an ambitious data governance strategy. So working with them ground up to understand which parts of the network are relevant to them, right-sizing the network approach, because it's in the end often about scale and resources and money and time and what you can and cannot affect. Being pragmatic is the entire point. Frequently, the non-holistic approaches would make it seem like you need to have done all 17 aspects of the Dharma wheel in order to be mature in your data system, but that's just not viable if you are a 7,000 person town. You don't need a master data framework right off the bat, for example. So the network will help to understand which ones are relevant and what effects investing in one component or another will have. So I've got 2 examples that will highlight what I'm talking about in a little bit more detail. So for example, if your goal is to break down internal data silos, you want more sharing between business units, one way this networked approach would show is by looking at the prerequisites for internal data sharing, what its dependencies are. You can see that having a data inventory is a classic prerequisite. If you don't know the data you have, it's difficult to know what's being shared with whom and how. So you could invest in developing one of those. Or understanding how data flows through your organization, charting, mapping that. Also a very useful, perhaps even necessary prerequisite to developing better internal data sharing. Data standards, another classic. If you don't have good data standards, then you can probably share data, but it might not be usable by the person you're sharing it with. So as you can see, the network shows all these dependencies and then shows the dependencies of the dependencies. So for example, for data standards, to have data standards, you need some form of data governance committee that is making organization-wide decisions about what these standards should be. Data standards don't just come from nowhere. Somebody has to make a decision about that. So that in itself has a prerequisite. And then you can understand, okay, we want to break down internal data silos, we need data standards. If we want data standards, we need a data governance committee. And this is how you can chart your way through to what would then become a digital strategy. Same applies for an inventory. To develop an inventory, you probably also need a data governance committee and data stewards in the individual units to track and list all the data sets they're using. For data flow architecture, you need to conduct a data maturity assessment prior to understand who's using what and how and where it's going. And the big one, of course, is always the culture and digital literacy internal. That's a complicated one, but 2 key prerequisites for that are having some form of charter document that lists the values and principles of the organization and a data governance committee. Again, unfortunately, it's in gold. You can't see it on this little map, but on the big one you can. Data governance committee is in gold because it's such a central component that almost everything charts back to it in one way or another. So, and then once you have started thinking about these sort of interconnected components and the systemic networked nature of it, then you start seeing the ecosystem values that arise out of these connections, out of this component of the network. Privacy becomes key. Security and risk when you're considering the interconnections between, say, an inventory and data sharing, or an inventory and open data. Internal skills and capacity is another classic values outcome that people seek. It is both a means and an end, which is always an interesting conversation. It's an end because it is a value in and of itself to have skilled and competent people, but having skilled and competent people is a means towards other things. So it has that dual function. And then improved service delivery is one of the outcomes that you could want from improved internal data sharing. The same applies for an open data program. So another example that we could give, here you can see the components in gold a bit better. Noting once again that this is a very much just a proof of concept map. It is neither finished nor comprehensive. It really just serves to show that you can make a map of dependencies, not that the map itself is complete. So for improved service delivery, we can do a similar charting exercise and see that for that you need database decision making. That's a pretty classic one. But for database decision making, you need an improved internal data or digital culture around capacity and skills and literacy. You need data sharing. You need a data strategy. And I could go on through the whole list, but I'm pretty sure you get the point by now. This is a way of mapping out the dependencies, and then through the dependencies, developing a strategy and seeing what values that strategy impacts in one way or another. So here we have a more informed and literate public, an equitable and anticipatory service improvements, aligned data and business strategies would be good outcomes from thinking through the issue of improved service delivery from this networked ecosystems perspective. Okay, last one of these Slidos, I promise. The question here is, when we're thinking about the organization from a systemic perspective, from a networked perspective, and from a system that thinks about itself, so it's a self-reflective system, because that's half the point of data governance, is to be self-aware and iterative and reflexive. To what degree are challenges, barriers, issues that you face regarding data use that arise on a daily, weekly, monthly, whatever basis, then reassessed on an organizational level? So local things, local challenges, project-based challenges that are then assessed on an organizational level to improve the organization as a whole system. Oh, I like these scores. Or are we going to end up with the inevitable bell curve of all statistics? All right, let us move on from there. Right, we were going to recap the key terms, but I feel like we have said them a lot already. Merlin's nodding. Yes, we have said them a lot. I don't think we need to say them again. So then we want to move on to the final Q&A part. If anybody has questions, we have our own questions for you that we've set up. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A if you have them. Or I believe you can raise your hand, but you can't speak because this is a webinar format, not the usual Zoom format.
We can allow them to talk. Yes.
Oh, we can. Excellent.
Yeah,
Maybe
we have that power, I think, is what I was told. So if you raise your hand, then I can unmute you.
Phenomenal. feel free to ask your own questions or respond to any of our questions, because we are just as interested in you as hopefully you are in us.
So Tom, while people are tripping over themselves to ask us questions, maybe I can pose a question to you that we can discuss. And you know, we talk a lot about um, cities, and we talk a lot about local government, but you know, we really have started to work outside of local government, you know, with civil society organizations that are very specifically focused, federal government. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are, you know, some of the similar challenges, and are there major differences that we're seeing in how data governance and network data governance can be enacted within those different ecosystems?
That's an interesting question. Obviously, as the organization gets bigger, it gets a lot more complicated. You have far more stakeholders involved. That said, if you start out from a mapping perspective and think carefully about who the relevant stakeholders are, it shouldn't actually make much of a difference. It might take longer and involve more people, but the mapping process remains the same. The whole idea behind the networked approach is that it's extremely scalable. It works on a very small scale as well as on a large scale. So I would say there isn't actually a notable difference.
One of the reasons I ask it is because I think what I see is that the sort of emphasis and the how we think of data governance can be different. So like when we're working in civil society, values, talking about values and basing decisions on values is very common. But then the technical capacity to back that up is significantly less. And I would say, you know, as we get into different orders of government, that flips, right? Trying to set up a data governance framework at the federal level that is based on an agreed set of values is fairly challenging. And then, you know, there's a bit of a middle ground there at local government, where used to the discussion of more values and including the public, and then a really varying degree of digital literacy and technical capacity.
That's interesting, but that segues nicely into some of the questions we're receiving in the Q&A. So Kelly asks, this may be a big question, but what is your number one tip for improving the culture for data standards? I'll go first. And the scale question, of course, here is maybe it does make a difference then. I mean, you're thinking about where and at what scale you're trying to change data standards. Starting small with a localized project, prove the efficacy of what you're doing, have backing from a data governance committee that can run the small project and then oversee its scaling to a larger project or even organization wide is definitely a strong way to go on that. And scale slowly, ensure that all the relevant stakeholders are involved in that process, so people can see the benefits, understand the benefits, rather than just experiencing them as a command from on high. That would be mine. Merlin, would you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just reemphasize the connection to an outcome that is salient. You know, we talk about problem identification or challenge identification of as having two major components. One is the challenge as it's being experienced. So whether that is a challenge that staff are experiencing, or whether that's a challenge that the residents, clients, beneficiaries are feeling that the staff are hearing. And then the second component of problem identification is why is it difficult to solve? Why does it still exist if we can name it? And I think, connecting data standards directly to those components of problem identification, as Tom said, makes it less of a command from above and oh yeah, that's why we have to do that, so we can help to solve these challenges. And then the other piece I would say too is the don't let I used to always hate this line, but don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And I think, starting out, there's a minimum standards, as a minimum interoperability. We work with an organization out of the EU that talks about minimum interoperability mechanisms, and I think that that's a good approach of like what can we do to get started, and what can we do that will help us move forward, build buy-in, build some momentum, and then we can improve from there.
I was just thinking, drawing on your experience with the Open Data Project and how it's changed in its goals and efficacy over the years. I wonder if there's parallels and lessons to be learned from how to start a project like that and how to scale it so that it's effective rather than just becoming another thing that you can say you've done and then ignore.
Yeah, I think there definitely are parallels. I mean, I think that open data has to be able to be open for all people, for all purposes, at all time, to be considered open, and seeing it at that scale is very difficult. And so I think even like improving a culture for data standards, if you can start, and again, it's just a repetition of what we've been saying, but if you can start smaller, and then start to scale from those experiences, you don't get overwhelmed, and you don't have so many restrictions, because your restrictions have to implicate everybody that is involved.
All right, we have another. Oh, sorry. Did you have more to say?
Go ahead.
We have another question, more of a comment, but it's an interesting one. I think it's worth getting into. Anonymous attendee says, the biggest or maybe earliest challenge in implementing data governance frameworks is the breadth of the work that needs to be done. It can be overwhelming to take on as a side of desk project. Yeah, so I mean, that's just always the problem, isn't it? Every time we are approached by one organization or another, it's because they have looked at the laundry list of things that they need to do and just been overwhelmed at the sheer scope of it. And that was actually probably the original initiating question that led to us rethinking how we think about data governance and how we think about strategizing for data governance, because so many of the frameworks either don't have a strategic element, by which I mean a guide for in what sequence to undertake steps, how to prioritize. They either don't have that, or when they do, it's a kind of one size fits all. Start here at ground zero and then work your way up, with the sort of assumption that maybe not everyone is at ground zero. So some people will be starting at, say, step 3 and then going up. But in our work, we found that just that's not what reality is like. It isn't this linear, predefined sequence of steps. It's much more complicated than that. There are all sorts of networked connections and interdependencies that have to be considered. Some of them will be at different levels of maturity in different parts of the organization. So the networked approach allows an organization to be a lot more pragmatic and goals-oriented, values-led, about choosing which components of the network to focus on, and so reduce the overwhelming part. The other part is the side of desk component of your comment. Yeah, I mean, there's no framework can help with that. That's just a resourcing question. And having a data governance committee that is endorsed by the C-suite and resourced, et cetera, to actually spend time on it as an official function of theirs is just sort of essential at this point. It has to be understood as a core component of everyday work. However, there is a fair amount of thinking, and we're involved in this too, in looking at ways in which improving data maturity as a whole, or data governance in particular, can be less intrusively implemented or inserted into everyone's lives. Once you start understanding that everyone is kind of already doing data governance in one way or another, it's less complicated to gently reformulate people's existing responsibilities and roles to include, at minimum, an awareness of data governance requirements, and so make it seem less like everything is being overhauled and changed, and more like it's just being adapted. Like small changes are being introduced that makes it much more palatable.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I think that the um, yes, just adding, a bit of a different or a new focus on the existing tasks. I think that you know, that's how we do it. But that the resource investment into a properly stood up data governance committee, I don't think you get away without doing that, because you need somewhere to aggregate these individual components. So if you have a privacy component that you are looking at through a networked lens, there's a need to aggregate it somewhere and then connect that to people who are, doing various inventories that are seeing that from a networked lens. Um, and so it can't be it can be a reallocation of resources, but it can't be, I don't think it can be a zero sum game. There does need to be some commitment to it, and some actual time dedicated to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It really should never be a side of desk um, part of anyone's job, especially in our current data infatuated, AI obsessed age. You just have to do data governance. Everything else borders on malfeasance. So the next question is from John Away. And he asks, hi, what's the fundraising strategy for collaborative data governance projects like these? What do you fundraise first in order to make the case? Support the development of other components while engaging stakeholders at different stages of the process. This sounds like an executive director question for an executive director.
Sounds like me being set up is what it sounds like. Thank you, Jean Nouet. You know, I think we are living this right now, and we are trying, and are struggling. And I think there's a couple things that we are finding has been helpful, um, and then I think a few things that are challenges that I think need to be mitigated. So helpful is, as we've discussed, is starting small and trying to get an initial proof of concept. And so starting small means minimal sources of data, because each source of data requires its own considerations, between access and ownership and control, and and then having a core partner. So in the work that we're doing, in Greater Montreal, we've been lucky enough to have a few core partners that really bring some credibility and some momentum to it. So the city of Montreal being one, and seeing it as a necessary component of their climate action work. The Montreal Climate Partnership and their connection to private sector and private sector organizations that are interested in climate action. And then the academic connection and an academic connection to people who understand data. So not just general connection to university, but those who understand the intricacies of dealing with data and how a data governance framework works. I think the challenges that need to be overcome that we're facing are when you're doing collaborative data governance across sectors, you've got different rules, you've got different ecosystems that are not necessarily used to being interconnected. And so the rules are different, the permissions, the bureaucracy is different, the technical capacity is different. And so there's a real need to, I think, move the collaborative along, even if it's slower than, and not have, one aspect of it progress too rapidly, and then the other ones are trying to catch up. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
All right. And we have one final question from anonymous attendee. I imagine that's the same anonymous attendee from before. Are there data governance framework templates available for municipalities beginning on this? Any recommendations? Yes, there absolutely are. We have several depending on the mood and flavor of the day. I recommend emailing us at info@opennorth.ca, and we will happily discuss our ones and others. We're not so special about that with you, and see what we can offer and recommend.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots, but I think if you take anything away from this, a template is only good in its ability to be broken and disaggregated and adapted to your environment. So a template can give you a place to start. And what we like to do when we're supporting organizations is to look at the problem. So we've written published papers on data governance for climate action. That's a very specific, it carves off the type of data and the sector actors and the ecosystem. And you're looking at a very specific shared goal. We have blogs on the importance of AI or data governance for AI. And again, it sort of carves off, gives it a specific focus, because I think, it's really difficult to look at a template and say, okay, here across our entire corporation, we're going to layer this template on. It becomes a real big challenge, and that's when it becomes overwhelming, especially when there's not sufficient resources invested into it.
Well, I think those are all the questions we have. So barring any further ones, we can give folks back some time in their day and go grab some coffee ourselves.
Tom, can you just put to the next slide for 1 minute?
There you go.
So yeah, contact information on our website. There are a list of resources for those of you representing cities. It's up in French right now. The English version will be coming soon, but there's documents on the work that we've been doing over the past 4 years with the City of Montreal and the data governance framework that we've developed there. And I think one of the interesting pieces of it is how the City of Montreal emphasized certain components over others. So they were very focused on legal and regulatory aspects of data governance. And so there's some visuals there and discussions on how we got to that point. And the next step there is taking that learning and adapting it or figuring out how to adapt it to other contexts. Thank you all very much. We look forward to hearing from you.